I'm Mary Crossan, Professor of Strategic Management at the Richard Ivey School of Business, and I'm delighted to be here today with Professor Elena Antonacopoulou from the University of Liverpool, talking about her research and its implications for management. Elena, I know you've had just an illustrious career covering many areas of research, but perhaps we can start by you talking a little bit about what your research has been about over time and some of the major themes about it.
Thank you for the opportunity to share some of what my journey entailed, because to call it illustrious is definitely extremely generous. The way I've approached my career has been to allow myself to demonstrate to myself and others what I care about. So I guess I've taken the meaning of career to mean what you are a carer of. So my research has given me the chance to show how much I care about learning predominantly, given as I feel I learn all the time. So to have taken learning as a core theme in my research has been an opportunity to discover through learning a variety of other connections that seem to have been the dominant focus of the scholarship that I have chosen to call my research practice. Essentially, the kind of themes I care to develop ideas around are learning, critical management education, because to me, learning isn't only something that happens in the workplace. It isn't only something that happens in a classroom context. It is something that it is part and parcel of our everyday practice. So to be able to see the connections between learning in those multiple contexts and across different units of analysis has definitely allowed me to see more clearly what might the practice of learning itself entail. And in doing that, certainly the last 6 years, shifting my focus specifically on these ideas around what practice is, how practices evolve, why are they important to management research specifically, I've come to appreciate even more why at the core of practice is its practice, i.e. the way practices are performed. And that ties neatly with my ongoing interest on change, emergence, and complexity, and that has enabled me to be able to say something about how these connections that have been so central in my understanding of how things come together are in constant flow, and this flow itself is indeterminate. So I guess that captures why, for me, caring about these ideas is also reflective of my love to see them grow in ways that I couldn't possibly predict. And that's, I think, the joy of doing research.
So then, when you've looked at the applications in organizational context and what managers would take away from your research, what are some of the key insights or applications that you've seen?
It's interesting because I think that one of the biggest challenges we all face is not to just see the application of our ideas, in other words, how it is utilized by business practitioners, but to demonstrate our ideas work because we put them to use first. So starting from how I as a practitioner have been using my ideas, the whole research I have been doing around learning, and let me give you one example. One of the earliest ideas from my learning research was to speak of individuals' predisposition to learning and how that affects what they learn, how they learn, and why they learn. So I've tried to capture the experiences of my studies of learning in organizations through these concepts I call philomathia and mathophobia. Now, this is my Greek character coming pretty much to the fore, but what these two words or concepts mean is the positive predisposition towards learning, which is philos, friend, and mathesis, which is the Greek word for learning, and mathophobia, which is the opposite, which is the negative predisposition to learn. Mathesis being the Greek word for learning again, and phobia, which we all recognize as a condition where even when you do recognize the need to learn, you may choose not to. So how this has helped practitioners is not that I have thought through these concepts to say, oh, you are philomathic and you are mathophobic, but instead to allow us to come closer to appreciating that we are learning not just from the experiences we encounter, our behaviors are not only demonstrations of our learning, our capacity to develop knowledge and new understanding is not all that learning is about, but in fact learning is all of those things and more, particularly our emotions, when our emotions come into play and allow us to feel closer what the experience of learning is like. So what practitioners that I've engaged in over the years, in a whole host of relationships, including inviting some of them as executives in residence in the Gnosis Initiative in Liverpool and in other institutions I previously was working, enabled us to experience learning directly and use that experience itself to say, well, if learning is so important, why is it that we take it so much for granted and yet so unconsciously participate in experiences without always learning from them? Mm-hmm. So my latest work looking into this whole idea of how we learn from crisis, for example, is trying to use these ideas to explain why we repeat mistakes. Mm-hmm. And why the tension between remembering and forgetting seems to be something that we have yet to fully understand.
So if exploring those ideas a little bit, what is it you think in organizations, if you take a look at leaders, why do they have such difficulty in many cases with learning? It is not just taken for granted, but in many ways it's not managed particularly well.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Well, some of the writing I have been doing in relation to leadership has allowed me to play with this idea of learning leadership. My description with Regina Bento, who is my co-author on a couple of pieces on this idea, is trying to suggest that leadership and learning, in some respects, like Peter Vale would treat as synonymous. We are learning to lead, and leadership is about learning. And therefore, for me, I think the message to practicing managers who take on leadership roles is to embrace those opportunities and experiences of leadership as an opportunity from which to learn about themselves, and in doing so, allowing themselves to manifest their leadership practice. In other words, to show themselves as leaders by virtue of being open to learn.
So what do you think gets in the way of leaders not doing that?
I think once one reaches a particular level of seniority, there is an assumption that they've learned enough. Mm-hmm. And that to me is almost like buying a ticket with no return. Mm-hmm. And that's unfair to them, because it's almost as if you limit the prospect of them continuing to grow as individuals. And if this whole experience of leadership and leading is all about giving ourselves and discovering ourselves in what we do, but also allowing ourselves to be surprised with what we can become, I think there shouldn't be any obstacles, because everyone should be allowed to continuously learn, but especially leaders should. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if there would be any obstacle, is them not managing perhaps sufficiently the expectations of others, in them having to know it all when clearly they naturally wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. And that may also help with what we see with a lot of leaders, that they become stale in their position. They become in some ways bored with what they're doing,
exactly,
having done the same thing over and over again, and lose what we what once have called the fire in their belly,
exactly,
which may in part be coming from that interesting time of life when you're learning a great deal. Is that your experience of
that? I think that's a very interesting point, because it reminds us that there is never a limited time or space for learning. In fact, learning by implication in the context of leadership is always incomplete, because the timing of learning is what makes learning timely in particular situations. But also any learning that has any significant effect has a timeless quality in shaping who we are in the process. So I would invite leaders to embrace the prospect of allowing themselves and those around them to be constantly surprised with the possibilities they generate as they remain open to the possibility of learning.
Now, another wonderful theme that comes out of your research in the practice-based view is that Many organizations, now if we go from the individual level of learning and thinking about leaders themselves learning to what organizations learn, you have done a lot of work around cautionary, I guess, work around best practices. This is not simply taking what happens in one organization and learning from it and adopting it in your own organization. The notion of promising practice has been a really interesting one. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that is immensely critical as we also try to understand leadership as a practice. Because what is a best practice is best under certain conditions in a particular context with certain personalities and idiosyncrasies coming together. The reason why this cannot be easily replicated, and that's where benchmarking ideas fall short, and that's why we've also seen limited evidence of best practices replicating with the same success in different contexts, is because those very conditions, by definition, couldn't be made to exist at a different point in time. Not even in the same organization, let alone in another organization. Mm-hmm. So really what our studies of practice have helped us appreciate is, and in particular why we're celebrating the promise of a practice rather than what is best or best features about it, is that practices aren't just what people do, but it is how they do what they do and why they do it in the ways they do. Mm-hmm. And therefore what is powerful when we turn again to apply this practice lens, not just in relation to the learning process, not just in relation to leadership, but pretty much everything that constitutes managing and organizing, is to appreciate that the practitioner is intimately connected to the practice. So we could not possibly call someone a leader if their practice did not reflect such a leadership. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the message again from an organizational point of view of the idea of practice is what works under certain conditions, try and understand not just by virtue of the structures and characteristics of the context in which activity takes place, but pay even more attention to the people, the practitioners involved, because it is their unique personalities, passion, perseverance in some respects, political astuteness being another, that allows that practice to be constantly practiced, i.e. performed in multiple ways, as they, in performing their practice, allow themselves to be best expressed.
And what I think is a hallmark of the kind of research that you do and the way you theorize about things and the interventions that you've done in organizations is really understanding a lot of that nuance and the detail and the context, the practitioner in the midst of it, which is absolutely powerful because it takes in many ways theories that we've had in the past that are much more generic in nature, have not necessarily played well in organizations, and helps to, let's go a layer deeper, several layers deeper, to really say, well, what's going on here? That also affords an opportunity to think about what are the implications for research, and if we could close with a few thoughts about that, because in many ways the research and academic community has proceeded in a particular way for a long period of time. The practice-based view and that practice orientation, now we can reflect back for the researchers to say, what are the implications for them? Could you take a few minutes to talk about that?
I consider that to be a very important aspect in completing the cyclicality of the process of understanding practice. In that we are all practitioners after all, whether we carry titles as academic or business executive or cleaner, at the end of the day, we are what we do, and we give in what we do parts of who we are. So I think one of the greatest insights I've gained through my ongoing interactions with the world of business practice that I bring to my research practice and to my community of practitioners called the Scholars in Business and Management is something actually we neglect that we do share in common across the different fields of practice, as I have distinguished them just now. And that is our common practice is re-search. You see, research is something we all do. But what differs is the ends to which such research is directed. Example, my interactions with business executives have allowed me to appreciate that they're constantly searching for business solutions. And the end result is improved performance in profitability terms. My interactions with policymakers have sensitized me to the fact that their research is searching and searching again to figure out ways in which social change can provide collective good. Our drive in doing research is driven by certain scientific principles. So acknowledging that our search is still a search that has no beginning, as in defined, and certainly no end, allows us to appreciate that one of the things that we can draw a lot more than perhaps we've cared to do before is, instead of creating divisions between what has been popularized in our world as the rigor and relevance debate, which basically divides academics or different communities given their particular roles as practitioners, I'd like to invite us to see actually the connections between us. And sharing research as a common practice is probably a wonderful way of celebrating how the world of business informs our research agendas, but also could help inform our research practice in ways that hopefully the ideas that we generate are usable, are actionable, because we've put them in practice first in our own worlds.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, you certainly live the research that you study. You're here in London, having made the trip to share that research with us, and we thank you for that.
Thank you for having me.